Hello, and welcome to today's episode. What you're about to hear is a story that will haunt you, challenge your perceptions, and hopefully open your eyes to the silent struggles many endure behind closed doors. This is the tragic tale of Jaden Parkinson, a bright, ambitious 17-year-old whose life was cruelly taken away, not by a stranger, but by someone she trusted and loved. This is more than just a story of loss. It's a wake-up call. It forces us to confront a harsh reality. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It can touch anyone and anywhere. And if we fail to recognize the signs, the consequences can be catastrophic. As one chilling quote from Jaden's story reminds us, what you are about to hear will make you look at parenting your children in a completely different light. In this episode, we'll delve into the life of Jaden Parkinson, uncover the warning signs of abuse she faced, and discuss what we can learn from her heartbreaking journey to protect others. This story isn't just about tragedy, it's about awareness, change, and the hope that we can do better. Let's begin. Jaden Parkinson was the kind of teenager who could light up a room. At just 17 years old, she had a zest for life that was infectious. Friends described her as kind, cheerful, and full of dreams for the future. She loved fashion, beauty, and most of all, she dreamed of becoming a hairdresser, a career she was determined to pursue. But Jaden's journey wasn't without its challenges. Her parents' divorce, when she was just 7, was a turning point in her young life. Despite the strong bond she shared with her mother, custody was awarded to her father, and Jaden, along with her siblings, moved to Oxford. This relocation marked the beginning of a complicated chapter for the family. Though Jaden lived with her father, her connection to her mother remained unbreakable. She would often visit her mom, finding comfort in her love and understanding. At 14, Jaden's life took another turn when she met Ben Blakely. Ben was 20 years old at the time, an older, charismatic figure who quickly became a central part of her world. But behind his charm lay a troubled and deeply dangerous man. Ben's upbringing was far from stable. He grew up in a foster family marked by neglect, violence, and dysfunction. His foster father's alcoholism and abusive behavior shaped the volatile person Ben would become. As a teenager, he developed a history of manipulation, cruelty, and even criminal behavior. By the time he crossed paths with Jaden, Ben was already deeply ensnared in a pattern of control and abuse that he would soon inflict upon her. In Jaden, Ben found someone he could manipulate and dominate, while Jaden, perhaps too young to recognize the warning signs, saw someone who promised her love and a bright future. What began as a teenage romance would spiral into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. It began like so many teenage love stories, an innocent connection sparked by chance. At 14, Jaden Parkinson met Ben Blakely during a visit to her mother's home. He was her boyfriend's older brother, a 20-year-old who exuded confidence and experience. For Jaden, a young girl navigating adolescence and the strains of a split family, Ben seemed to be everything she wanted, someone who paid attention to her, who made her feel special. Despite the significant age gap and the concerns voiced by those around her, Jaden saw no danger in their relationship. She believed she had found someone who would protect and love her. But the reality was far from the fairy tale she imagined. From the start, there were signs that something wasn't right. Ben's behavior was intoxicatingly intense. He showered Jaden with attention, constantly wanting to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. At first, it might have felt flattering, an older man who seemed so deeply interested in her life. But soon this interest turned into possessiveness. He began isolating her from her friends, criticizing her choices, and making her feel as though her worth depended solely on his approval. Jaden was still just a teenager, new to relationships, and Ben exploited this inexperience. He would accuse her of lying, invent betrayals that didn't exist, and even manipulate her into apologizing for things she hadn't done. His tactics were deliberate and calculated, designed to erode her confidence and make her dependent on him. But it didn't stop at manipulation. Ben's behavior escalated into outright cruelty. He had a history of violence, a dark side that Jaden began to glimpse as their relationship progressed. One of the most chilling examples of his brutality came when, during an argument, he killed her pet cat, a beloved companion that Jaden deeply cared for. He decapitated the animal and placed its head in her bed, a horrifying act of intimidation. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a clear message. You belong to me. You cannot escape. At this point, Jaden's life began to spiral. She was caught in a web of manipulation, fear, and emotional entanglement. Despite the abuse, she found herself unable to break free. Ben was a master manipulator, alternating between moments of affection and episodes of rage. He made her believe that the abuse was her fault, convincing her that she deserved the treatment she was receiving. For a young girl with little life experience, it was nearly impossible to recognize that she was being abused, let alone figure out how to escape it. Jaden's family could see what was happening. Her parents, despite their divorce, tried to intervene, pleading with her to leave Ben. Her mother, in particular, worked tirelessly to bring Jaden home and away from the toxic relationship. But every time Jaden tried to leave, Ben would pull her back in. He used threats, manipulation, and even violence to maintain his grip on her. Eventually, in a desperate attempt to escape, Jaden sought refuge at a homeless shelter. For a teenager, this was an extraordinary step. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was the only place she believed Ben couldn't reach her. At the shelter, she began to find glimmers of hope. The staff, trained to recognize abuse, tried to help Jaden understand the toxic environment she had been living in. They assured her that she didn't have to endure Ben's behavior, that she deserved safety and freedom. For the first time, Jaden started to believe there might be a way out. But Ben wasn't willing to let her go. He tracked her down even at the shelter, refusing to relinquish his control. His presence was a constant reminder of the danger she faced. He went as far as forbidding her from using the bathroom without his permission, an act of humiliation and domination that showed how deep his need for control ran. Even as she began to see glimpses of the reality she was trapped in, Ben's grip on her psyche was still strong. Jaden's attempts to escape were brave, but ultimately futile. Despite her growing awareness of Ben's abusive nature, she couldn't completely disentangle herself from the emotional and psychological hold he had over her. Each time she tried to break free, the weight of his threats and the fear of his retaliation pulled her back into his orbit. What started as a teenage romance had become a living nightmare. The more Jaden tried to fight for her freedom, the more Ben's cruelty escalated. He wasn't just dangerous, he was relentless, determined to control her life at all costs. And tragically, Jaden's courage to escape wasn't enough to shield her from the storm that was about to come. December 3rd, 2013 was a day that began with hope for Jaden Parkinson, a fragile hope that things might finally take a turn for the better. She had recently discovered she was pregnant, and despite everything she had endured, Jaden believed that this news might lead to reconciliation with Ben Blakely. Perhaps this baby would bring out a gentler side of the man who had caused her so much pain. In her mind, this meeting could be the start of something new, for herself, for her unborn child, and for her future. At 3:30 that afternoon, Jaden left her home to meet Ben at Oxford Station. CCTV footage shows her walking toward him, a mix of determination and nervousness in her expression. The two boarded a train to Didcot, where Ben had promised they could have a peaceful conversation. A picnic, he said, where they could talk things through in private. Jaden, trusting and hopeful, agreed. But Ben had no intention of reconciliation. As they walked into the countryside, his demeanor began to shift. What started as a civil conversation turned into a tirade of accusations. He refused to believe that Jaden's pregnancy was his, hurling insults and accusing her of infidelity. Jaden tried to defend herself, pleading with him to see reason, but every word she spoke only seemed to fuel his growing rage. Their path led them to an old, abandoned barn, isolated and eerie, far from any prying eyes. Ben, still maintaining the pretense of wanting to talk, convinced Jaden to step inside. She had no idea that this would be the last place she would ever see. Once inside, Ben's anger boiled over. His accusations turned to physical violence. He struck Jaden, knocking her to the ground, and as she tried to pick herself up, he unleashed his full fury. He grabbed her by the throat, his hands tightening with brutal force. Jaden fought back with everything she had, but Ben's strength and rage were overpowering. She gasped for air, her desperate cries for help fading as he strangled her. In those final moments, Jaden's life slipped away, her dreams and her unborn child's future stolen in an act of monstrous cruelty. After committing this heinous act, Ben calmly left Jaden's lifeless body in the barn and returned home. CCTV footage at the railway station captured him boarding a train back to Didcot, his demeanor eerily composed. He had a plan, and he was already thinking about how to cover his tracks. Days later, Ben returned to the barn, this time with his younger brother Jake. Using his manipulative charm, Ben convinced Jake to help him. He told Jake they were digging a hole to hide something harmless, like a weapon, and Jake, fearful of his older brother's temper, complied. Together, they dug a shallow grave in a field near the barn. Once the grave was ready, Ben placed Jaden's body inside, covering it with soil as though he were burying a piece of his past. But even this wasn't enough for Ben. Days later, he returned to the grave, driven by some twisted compulsion. He exhumed Jaden's body, now decomposing, and stuffed her remains into a large suitcase he had brought with him. With shocking calmness, he hailed a taxi in the middle of the night. The driver, noticing Ben's muddy appearance and the unusual size of the suitcase, didn't ask questions and took him to a nearby church. At the church, Ben had already prepared another grave, this time in the cemetery, surrounded by headstones. He had manipulated Jake into digging this grave earlier, claiming it was for a dead animal. Under the cover of darkness, Ben buried Jaden's body again, this time on hallowed ground. It was a chilling act of desecration carried out with no regard for the girl he had so callously murdered. What should have been a day of reconciliation and hope turned into a nightmare. Jaden's trust in Ben, her hope for a brighter future, had led her into the hands of a manipulative and violent man. And while Ben thought he had successfully buried the evidence of his crime, the truth was about to rise from the shadows, ensuring that Jaden's story would not remain hidden forever. When Jaden Parkinson failed to return home, her family's worst fears began to surface. Her mother, who had grown increasingly concerned about Jaden's relationship with Ben Blakely, immediately knew something was wrong. Days passed without any word from Jaden, no phone calls, no texts. This silence was completely out of character. On December 4th, 2013, just a day after Jaden's disappearance, her family reported her missing to the police. The investigation began immediately. Officers canvassed the area, interviewed Jaden's friends and family, and reviewed CCTV footage from Oxford Station, where she had last been seen with Ben. It quickly became clear that Ben Blakely was a key figure in Jaden's disappearance. His history of violence and his known relationship with Jaden made him the prime suspect. But Ben was uncooperative from the start. When questioned, he denied seeing Jaden on the day she disappeared, claiming they hadn't spoken in weeks. His behavior during interviews was erratic. He alternated between anger, arrogance, and veiled threats toward investigators. Police knew he was hiding something, but without evidence, their hands were tied. Then, a crucial break came in the case. A taxi driver came forward with a chilling story. He recalled picking up a disheveled Ben late at night, carrying an unusually large suitcase. The driver remembered dropping him off at a nearby church, which had a cemetery on its grounds. This testimony led police to focus their search on the churchyard. Meanwhile, forensic evidence and witness accounts were beginning to piece together the puzzle. CCTV footage showed Ben and Jaden together at Oxford Station, then Ben returning alone hours later, visibly agitated. Investigators also turned their attention to Ben's younger brother Jake, who had been seen with Ben during this time. Under pressure, Jake finally confessed that his brother had coerced him into digging two graves, one in a field near an abandoned barn and another in the church cemetery. Jake explained that he had been terrified of Ben, who had threatened him into silence. Although he hadn't known the full extent of what Ben had done, he admitted that he had helped bury Jaden's body. With this information, police intensified their search. On December 19, 2013, nearly 2 weeks after Jaden's disappearance, officers discovered her remains in the cemetery. The body had been stuffed into a suitcase and buried in a shallow grave, a gruesome and heartbreaking end to the search. The autopsy confirmed what investigators feared. Jaden had been strangled to death, and bruises on her body indicated she had suffered severe physical abuse before her murder. Forensic evidence left no doubt. Jaden had been killed by Ben Blakely. For Jaden's family, the discovery of her body was devastating, but it also brought a bittersweet sense of closure. The search for their beloved daughter and sister was over, but the fight for justice had only just begun. With Jaden's remains discovered and Ben Blakely firmly in the spotlight, the police turned their attention to building an airtight case against him. The investigation revealed a chilling timeline of events, supported by critical pieces of evidence that painted a clear picture of Ben's role in Jaden's disappearance and murder. First, CCTV footage became a cornerstone of the case. Cameras at Oxford Station captured Jaden and Ben together on the day she vanished. They were seen boarding a train to Didcot, where Ben later returned alone, visibly agitated. This footage directly contradicted Ben's earlier claims that he hadn't seen Jaden for weeks. It proved not only that he had been with her, but also that he was the last person to see her alive. Investigators also collected testimonies from Jaden's family and friends, which painted a damning portrait of Ben's abusive and manipulative behavior. Multiple witnesses described how Ben had isolated Jaden, controlled her every move, and physically assaulted her. These accounts were bolstered by Jaden's own documented attempts to escape from him, including seeking refuge at her mother's home and later at a shelter. Together, these testimonies established a clear pattern of abuse that escalated to murder. When confronted with this mountain of evidence, Ben did what he always did. He tried to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He denied having anything to do with Jaden's death, claiming he hadn't been in contact with her. When that story fell apart under the weight of the evidence, he changed tactics, claiming he suffered from mental illness and couldn't be held accountable for his actions. This strategy backfired. Court-appointed psychiatrists determined that Ben was fully aware of his actions at the time of the murder. He was not mentally ill, but rather a cold and calculated individual who had meticulously planned and executed his crimes. Another critical element of the trial was the involvement of Ben's younger brother, Jake. Police discovered that Jake had helped Ben dig graves, first near the abandoned barn and later at the church cemetery. Initially, Jake's role cast suspicion on him as a possible accomplice. However, during the trial, Jake testified that he had acted under duress, terrified of his older brother's violent tendencies. Jake explained that Ben had threatened him, and he feared for his life if he refused to comply. This testimony was corroborated by Ben's well-documented history of coercion and intimidation, and the court ultimately accepted that Jake had been a victim of Ben's manipulation. The evidence against Ben was overwhelming, and the police left no stone unturned in their pursuit of justice for Jaden. From CCTV footage to witness accounts and forensic evidence, every piece of the puzzle confirmed the same truth. Ben Blakely had taken Jaden's life in an act of calculated cruelty. The stage was now set for the courtroom, where Jaden's family and friends would fight to ensure her killer was held accountable. The court proceedings were both shocking and revealing. Throughout the trial, Ben showed no remorse for his actions. He was erratic, frequently interrupting proceedings with inappropriate outbursts, laughter, and even threats. His complete lack of empathy and acknowledgement of guilt only solidified the jury's decision. After hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict. Ben Blakely was found guilty of premeditated murder. The judge sentenced Ben to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years. While no sentence could undo the harm he caused or bring Jaden back, this ruling ensured that Ben would be held accountable for his horrific actions and that he would be unable to harm anyone else for decades. The case also addressed the role of Ben's younger brother, Jake Blakely. Jake had helped Ben bury Jaden's body under duress, a fact he revealed during the investigation. He explained how Ben had coerced him with threats and intimidation, leaving him terrified of the consequences of disobedience. Jake's testimony convinced the jury that he was another victim of Ben's manipulation, not a willing accomplice. As a result, Jake avoided imprisonment, though the emotional scars of his involvement in such a horrific crime would undoubtedly linger. This case was more than just a tragic story. It was a wake-up call. It underscored the systemic failures in recognizing and intervening in situations of domestic abuse. The signs were there: Jaden's isolation, her physical injuries, and her repeated attempts to escape. Yet the response wasn't enough to protect her from the escalating violence that ultimately claimed her life. For Jaden's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but also a profound sense of loss. Her mother has since spoken out about the need for greater awareness and education around domestic violence, particularly for young people. She emphasized that understanding the warning signs and knowing where to turn for help can save lives. While Ben Blakely is now behind bars, Jaden's story remains a powerful reminder of the urgent need to address domestic violence at every level, through education, intervention, and stronger legal protections. Justice was served, but the lessons from this case must continue to guide us toward a future where no one suffers as Jaden did. Jaden Parkinson's story is one of unimaginable tragedy, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked abuse and manipulation in relationships. Her life, so full of promise and potential, was stolen by someone who claimed to love her, but whose actions revealed only control, cruelty, and violence. Her death is a chilling example of what happens when the warning signs of abuse go unaddressed. Isolation, manipulation, coercion, and physical harm. These were all red flags that Jaden endured, yet she struggled to escape. Her tragic end underscores the vital importance of recognizing these signs, both in our own lives and in the lives of those we care about. Before we wrap up, I want to thank you for listening and for taking the time to reflect on Jaden Parkinson's story. Her life may have been cut short, but her legacy can inspire real change. Let's honor her memory by paying closer attention to the people we care about, by supporting victims of abuse, and by standing up against violence in all its forms. If you found Jaden's story impactful, please consider liking this episode, leaving a comment, and sharing your thoughts. We'd also love for you to subscribe to the channel so you can join us for more stories like this. Stories that not only inform but also inspire change. Take care of yourself, cherish your loved ones, and remember, together, we can make a difference. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next episode.